Good evening, everyone. It's Cooper Walty, for those of you who don't know me. I was in Canto 10 on Dante's Inferno, so without further ado, let's jump right in. So, a brief overview of this canto. Um, it was set in the sixth circle of hell, which is primarily focused on punishing malice and fraud. Um, in this particular canto, we're actually punishing what's called heresy, but we'll get into that into more detail very shortly. The kind of the main premise, which we'll also get into, is that Dante and Virgil enter the city of Dis on the sixth circle of hell, which is actually for punishing the more severe sins. Some of the key characters in this canto are Dante, obviously, Virgil, the Epicureans themselves, led by Farinata, and then also Cavalcante, which we'll get into. And something I skipped the kind of general premise here. When they enter this canto, they're entering the tomb of the Epicureans. Farinata indicates early on that there are more than 1,000 of them in that tomb, including himself, which he is the emperor. And a couple key takeaways are the use of imagery, the fiery tombs, as well as the use of irony, right? The whole reason they're there is that they deny the spiritual afterlife, and now they're condemned to a life of fiery eternity. So getting right into the sin, as I mentioned, we have malice and fraud, but most importantly, heresy. I pulled this quote from the canto: "With Epicurus, all his followers, who with the body make the spirit die." And so what this kind of means is that they denied the immortality of the soul, so they did not believe in the afterlife, and therefore, because of that, they were sent to hell and forced to live the rest of eternity in a fiery tomb. Canto 10 takes a shift from the previous cantos. There's less discussion of more, the grotesque punishment, and more geared towards philosophical dialogue. This is actually probably one of the more philosophical charged cantos thus far, in my opinion. And then I kind of just, what heresy is, or heretics, is deliberately believing and spreading doctrines that contradict the Christian faith. So what happened, right? What happened in Canto 10? Well, as I mentioned, Virgil leads Dante into the tomb. Virgil and Dante hear a voice. They discover that it's the voice of Farinata, who emerges from his tomb to speak them. And now an important detail here is when Farinata arises from the tomb, he's proud, he's stood up tall, broad shoulders, stern brow, he's described as. This is important because Cavalcante was the opposite. In fact, he only peeked his head out of the tomb, and that symbolizes that, right? Farinata is a more proud, more prominent person, whereas Cavalcante might be a little bit more reserved. So moving on, after they enter the tomb and they are speaking with Farinata, Farinata explains to Dante that their ancestors were enemies. This kind of adds to what we're going to get into in the next slide, the historical and political aspect to the canto. And then after that discussion, which we will talk about more shortly, Cavalcante emerges from his tomb and recognizes Dante. As you probably know, Dante is a friend, the best friend of Cavalcante's son Guido. And a big theme here that is important to mention is that, we'll also get into this, is that the condemned can't see the present, they only see the future. So this is a brilliant example of this, because Cavalcante believes his son is dead. And Dante is unable to even communicate to him that Guido's not dead, because he goes right back in the tomb. But the important part of this is that the condemned can't see the present. So getting into that deeper meaning that I mentioned, the political aspect of this canto, right? So political implications. Farinata was I'm going to butcher these names, but he was a Ghibelline, and Dante was a Guelph. So their dialogue connects with a specific battle from the past, which was the Battle of Montaperti, where the Ghibellines actually defeated the Guelphs. So Farinata would have beat Dante and his team. Furthermore, Cavalcante was also a Guelph, which may be one of the reasons that in the canto, Farinata and Cavalcante never acknowledge each other. In fact, at some point, Dante asks Farinata to kind of convey that message that Guido is not dead, but he doesn't even acknowledge that request because they don't speak to one another. At some point, Farinata and Dante are able to find common ground. That is around the city of Florence, where after the Ghibellines beat the Guelphs, Farinata actually kind of imposed mercy and didn't destroy the city of Florence out of respect for the city and the beauty it brought. But they were able to find some kind of common ground. And this actually leads to Dante kind of speaking of um, um, Farinata, who is condemned to hell, kind of more positively than we would expect, right? He right away describes him as um, stood up tall and proud, and he later gets into actually kind of hinting that he might be a little noble. So again, this political aspect is a classic example of the war between church and state. If you've taken any history class, you've heard examples of this. But as we know, church would be the Guelphs, who believe in spiritual pureness and support the church, and then Farinata himself was the Holy Roman Emperor, which was what the Guelphians or the state supported. So the kind of a final connection here is that Dante is explaining to us how war and political conflict can lead to spiritual and moral demise overall. So to touch on a couple of the key characters a little more in depth, I'm going to start with Farinata. So Farinata, though damned to hell, is presented to us, like I mentioned, by Dante with some nobility, due to him sparing the city of Florence. Farinata was, as I mentioned, the emperor of the Ghibellines, and Dante comes from one of the most powerful Guelph families of that time. So it's kind of similar to, I believe it was the Montagues and the other family of Romeo and Juliet. It gave me that kind of vibe, for lack of a better word. And then Farinata was one of the largest characters in the canto overall, so it's important to kind of go a little bit more in depth in him. He represents political loyalty, and of course, the reason he's there, his spiritual blindness. So moving on to Cavalcante, a little bit less here, but as we know, he's the father of Guido, which would be Dante's best friend. He does show emotional vulnerability and also concern about his son, and this kind of represents that though they are dead, condemned to hell, there are aspects of personality. And then his confusion of Guido's fate, right? He thinks Guido's already dead. I drew the connection that it's because he can see the future, not the present, and obviously Guido will die in the future, so he's confused because he can't see the present, he can't see that Guido is alive. I thought it was important to mention that. So getting on to the actual punishment of the sin heresy, the sin being punished, committed by the Epicureans, is their overall spiritual blindness, otherwise known as heresy. Epicurus, which is what Epicureans come from, the face behind the group was one of the earlier representations of atheism. I actually, doing some research, it mentioned that he himself lived before Christ. I know that's a bit of a gray area, hard to explain, but he became one of the early symbols of atheism and what it was to not believe in a higher power. So why was the sin so severe? Well, without even getting into what's on the slide, as we all know, religion was a more prominent and important thing in the past than it is today. So the sin was so severe because it denied the possibility of eternal reward, or the opposite, being condemned or punished. And then it undermines the justice of God, right? Just how we have a legal system back then. I don't want to say back then, but in the past, their legal system, their judges was God. You were to be judged by God in the afterlife. So without heaven or hell and this belief in it, there becomes no reason to live a morally, spiritually disciplined life for people. So to wrap it all up, as I mentioned, we are in the sixth circle of hell in the city of Dis. We're punishing the sin heresy. The punishment they're actually experiencing are fiery tombs, which symbolize there's a typo there. I'm not recording this. I'm not re-recording this. Their denial of the afterlife and how they're entrapped. So the major characters to take away here are Farinata and his Epicureans, and then Cavalcante, who is again the father of Guido, Dante's best friend. Another key takeaway I want to stress again is that they have the knowledge of the future but not the present. I would bet that we'll hear more about that point. And the political message, right, that we mentioned earlier, which is kind of one of the key takeaways overall from this canto. Then lastly, as I mentioned, it is one of the more philosophical cantos this far and focuses more on politics rather than just strict punishment of sin. Thank you. Hope you guys all had as much fun as I did making a presentation, and have a good one.